of the key figures in this book and who shaped the history of our country are here with us today. And that tells another story all by itself. And that is something truly unique about Nigeria, our ability to move beyond the past, no matter how bitter and no matter how adversarial our past relationship may have been, and to still come together. So seated amongst us here today is General Yakubu Gowon, who became Nigeria's head of state at the age of 32 and led the country for 9 years. His government was overthrown in 1975 by a coup involving the then Brigadier Olusegun Obasanjo and the then Brigadier Theophilus Danjuma, and the author himself, I confirm, the then Lieutenant Colonel Babangida, who was then commander of the newly formed Armored Corps. Also involved in that coup were the then Lieutenant Colonels Muhammadu Buhari, Lieutenant Colonel Sani Bello, who is here also, and Lieutenant Colonel Sani Sami. Yet, here we are today with former President Obasanjo, General Danjuma, and of course the author himself present, not as adversaries of the author, but as witnesses to history, celebrating a fellow statesman. In a striking turn of fate, the author notes that it was President Obasanjo who, after the tragic assassination of General Murtala Mohammed, insisted that a young Lieutenant Colonel Babangida be appointed to the Supreme Military Council, making him its youngest member at the time. Also represented here is the immediate past president, Muhammadu Buhari, another leader whose path intertwined with Babangida. It was former President Babangida who played a key role in the coup that brought President Buhari to power in 1983, and later in another coup that removed him and brought Babangida himself into power. Yet today, President Buhari is represented at this occasion, celebrating the man who overthrew him and detained him for 3.5 years, his one-time old adversary, former President Babangida. And then, of course, there's a gentleman here who was an elected senator in 1992 in the cause of Babangida's transition program. When Babangida annulled the 1993 election and General Abacha took over and dissolved the Senate, that senator tried to reconstitute the Senate in resistance to the dissolution. He was detained, charged to court. He escaped into exile. Today, he is also here to celebrate with his former tormentors. But as president, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, President Bola Ahmed TINUBU. The third reason why this 420-page book is important is because it unveils one of the most enigmatic leaders that Nigeria has ever had. A man who some called Maradona, others described as the evil genius, bearing his mind, in his own words, in writing for the first time since he left office 32 years ago. In this compelling account, he tells of his early life in Minna, his parents, his siblings, his primary school, Gwari Native Authority Primary School, how he became an orphan at the age of 14, and at age 16, entering the provincial secondary school Bida, the school which later became known as the Government College Bida. His class, the class of 1957 to 1962, which, as you have heard, produced 2 Nigerian presidents, 4 state governors, a former Chief Justice of the Federation, several federal ministers. His classmates, former President Abdul Salami Abubakar, Sani Sami, Sani Bello, Garba Duba, Gado Nasco, Abdul Mumuni Keki Manga, Muhammad Maman Magoro, Paul Babale, and Maman Vatsa, who joined the class in their third year. Babangida reveals his nickname. That's the nice one, the nice nickname to readers. He was called the Blockbuster for his sporting exploits. But Gado Nasco and Ismaila Ahmed coined a nastier nickname for him. That nickname was Kulele. Kulele meaning because of his stocky physique. And the author notes jokingly in the book, I never forgave them for this. Babangida became the head boy of the school in his final year. Then he tells the story of how he changed his name from birth, which was Ibrahim Badamasi, to Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida. He recalls that during official engagements, officers confused his name, Badamasi, with the Yoruba name Badamosi, and many repeatedly asked him whether he was Yoruba. That question had also come up a few years before during his enlisting interview for the military. He says, to eliminate any confusion, I quote him, I decided to take on my father's other name, Babangida, as my last name. He tells the story of how he became interested in the military. A certain teacher, Pa Onimole, who as a 24-year-old had taken up a voluntary 3-month leave of absence from his teaching job at King's College in 1930 to help set up and popularize science education in northern Nigeria, and who ended up spending his entire teaching career in the north. By the time he died at 78 in 1984, Pa Onimole had taught and mentioned several generations of students in northern Nigeria, including General Yakubu Gowon and the author. But more than just laying a sound science foundation, writes the author, Pa Onimole was the first to get many of us interested in a career in the military. Shortly after independence in 1960, Pa Onimole invited his former student, Captain Yakubu Gowon, to give us a career talk on the military. Captain Gowon, handsome and smart-looking, in his properly starched army officer's uniform, spoke to us brilliantly in his now familiar shrill voice on the benefits of military career. His career talk left a mark that stayed with most of us, and several of us joined the military. However, in a remarkable twist of fate, several years later, Yakubu Gowon became head of state. He was deposed in a coup in which the author participated, as you've heard. And while living in England, Yakubu Gowon was implicated unjustly, according to the author, by Dimka, who had led a failed coup. The Supreme Military Council then decided to strip General Yakubu Gowon of his rank as a 4-star general and dismissed him from the army. The author writes, and I quote him, although I was a member of the Supreme Military Council that made that painful decision on General Gowon, I am happy that as president, I restored his benefits and full rights in 1986 as a distinguished general of the Nigerian Army, end of quote. The author also tells the story of his combat experience during the Civil War. His favorite commanders were General Wushishi and General Danjuma. The most unfortunate aspect of the war experience for him was that it brought him into combat confrontation with some officers from the Biafran side, with whom he had trained as a cadet, who now had to fight on the Biafran side. Interestingly, a good number of them who survived remained his friends after the war and long afterwards. But perhaps the most unforgettable experience of the Civil War for him was the injury that nearly killed him. In the course of a firefight in Uzuakoli, Umahia, he was hit by shrapnel that eventually was lodged in his chest. And he tells of how he was evacuated to the Lagos University Teaching Hospital, Idi Araba, And while he was in hospital recovering from his injuries, on Saturday, April 19, 1969, he watched on television in the common room of the hospital as the then head of state and commander-in-chief, General Yakubu Gowon, married his beautiful black beauty, the then Victoria Zachary. There and then, he made up his mind to get married. And he already knew who he wanted to marry. And he went looking for her as soon as he left the hospital. She was also a black beauty, the then Maria Okogo. He met her through his childhood friend and her cousin, Gaba Duba, and she lived with her uncle, Gaba Duba's father. When he proposed to her, she turned him down because of his reputation as a playboy. But she later agreed after her uncle put a word in for him, and she became Mariam Babangida. The author devotes a whole chapter to her remarkable life and times as a devoted wife, mother of his children, generous hostess, and the First Lady of Nigeria, who redefined the office of First Lady and went on to engage in some of the most consequential social investment programs of that period, including the Better Life for Rural Women program. The author also gives his own account of his much talked about dramatic encounter with Dimka, the leader of the coup that led to the assassination of the then head of state, General Murtala Mohammed. He recalls that Dimka was holed up at the broadcasting station immediately after the assassination of the then head of state, General Murtala Mohammed. The author relates how, not knowing that there had been a coup attempt, he arrived for a meeting with General Akinriyade at the army headquarters. And as he sauntered into the top floor of the building, the general shouted at him, "Ibrahim, where the hell have you been? We've been looking for you. You must now go and see TY immediately." Convinced I was being sought after, and I'm quoting him now, because of our ongoing meeting on the Army's reorganization, I looked at my wristwatch and told the general, "I'm still on time. It's not even 9 a.m. yet." And General Akinriyade shouted back at me, "Who's talking of a meeting? Haven't you heard what has happened? The head of state has just been assassinated. And Major Dimka has made a broadcast claiming to have taken over." He then went to General Danjuma's office, and the author writes that General Danjuma's instructions to me when I met with him were unambiguous. Go to the radio house and flush Dimka out of that place immediately. When he got to the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation radio house at Ikoyi in an armored column, we noticed that Dimka's men surrounded the place, primarily young officers who were part of the plot, including his ADC, Second Lieutenant Samuel Gaba. As I got down from my armored vehicle, unarmed, and approached the building, Dimka's ADC, Gaba, attempted to stop me. By now, Dimka had spotted me from the story building, and he screamed, "Ibrahim, I'm going to shoot you." I shouted back, "Well, that's okay. If you shoot me, you know my family, you'll take care of them. They'll become your responsibility. I have no problem. It would be nice to die in the hands of a friend." After a pause, Dimka soberly replied, "Come upstairs, come upstairs." And Dimka was indeed a close friend, one of the groomsmen at my wedding to Mariam in Kaduna in 1969. When I got upstairs, I could tell from his breath that he had had a lot to drink. The stench of alcohol around him and his voice was pungent. Then suddenly his ADC, also visibly drunk, nervously showed up and suggested that Dimka take me hostage and use me as a bargaining chip with the government. Dimka angrily screamed at Gaba and chased him out. Once Gaba scampered out, Dimka and I settled for a frank discussion. In doing so, I reminded him of the need to keep things under control, avoid flaring tempers in the circumstances we had found ourselves in. First, he wanted to know if I had come to trick him into some form of surrender. When I convinced him that was not my mission, he calmed down and listened. He said he wanted a change of government. He even attempted to persuade me to join in the attempt. But even as he made that intolerable request of me, it was apparent from his body language that he knew that the game was up. Then his tone started to change. Could I guarantee his safety? Could I negotiate a written amnesty for him and all his co-plotters? Again, as I had done earlier, I pleaded with him to give himself up and avoid any form of conflagration that could kill civilians and soldiers. That chit-chat went on for some time, and I appeared not to be making a headway, but I left him with a promise to return later. I returned to brief General Danjuma on my encounter. Danjuma was furious. He ordered me back to the radio house with a reiteration of his earlier instructions: flush Dinka out of that place immediately. I returned to Radio House with Chris Igokwe, better equipped and prepared. I'll leave you to read what happened next. Buy the book. But the reasons why this autobiography is long, and is long awaited, beg your pardon, is more because of the innumerable controversies that were spurned in the Babangida era. Babangida himself described these events, and I quote, "the events that shook the administration to its foundations under our watch," end of quote. These include the death of Dele Giwa, the killing by a letter bomb of the charismatic journalist and publisher of Newswatch, a weekly political news magazine, in his home on October the 19th, 1986. The Vatsa coup, a coup that implicated one of his closest childhood friends, and the decision of the Supreme Military Council to execute him. The Gideon Oka coup, a coup that took the life of his ADC and nearly took his own life and that of his wife, and how they escaped the coupists, and the coup was foiled by the then Chief of Army Staff, General Sani Abacha. The OIC palaver, the controversy as to whether the government had surreptitiously taken Nigeria into membership of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. The 1989 SAP riots, the deadly riots over the harsh economic effects of the government's structural adjustment policy. The C-130 air crash on September 26, 1992. The crash of the Nigeria Air Force Lockheed C-130 transporter aircraft in the swamps of off the Lagos coast, barely 3 minutes after taking off from the Ikeja airport, killing a total of 159 officers, including the crew and 9 foreigners. The crash wiped out some of the brightest and best middle cadre officers of the time, and there was the allegation that the government masterminded the crash to stave off a coup against the administration, especially since the failure of the Oka coup. Then there is a full chapter devoted to the transition to military rule and the June 12 saga. June 12 was a decision with cataclysmic consequences. It was the annulment of what had been said to be the freest and fairest elections in Nigeria's history. The annulment led to a military interregnum that was considered one of the most vicious in Nigeria's history. The eventual death of the acclaimed winner of the election and his wife. The author deals with all these issues, and for the first time, answers these questions fully. For example, he tells us for the first time who annulled the June 12th election. Of course, I will not disclose that to you. You would have to buy the book to find out. He puts the facts out there. He gives his own reasons for the actions that he took, and he admits where he believes he was wrong. He also answers the question whether Abiola actually won the June 12th elections. And I quote him, "Although I am on record to have stated after the elections that Abiola may not have won the elections, upon deeper reflection and a closer examination of all available facts, particularly the detailed election results, which are published as an appendix to this book, there was no doubt that MKO Abiola won the June 12th elections. Upon closer examination of the original collated figures from the 110 polling booths nationwide, it was clear that he satisfied the two main constitutional requirements for winning the presidential elections, mainly majority votes and geographical spread. Having obtained 8,128,720 votes against TOFA's 5,848,247 votes, and securing the mandatory 1/3 of the votes cast in 28 states of the Federation, including Abuja, and ratified that the Buhari administration finally recognized him as a former head of state of Nigeria. End of quote. He concludes in the book, and I quote him, "Looking back now, the June 12th saga was undeniably the most challenging moment of my life, and in certain respects, one of the most painful." And he went on to admit, "If I had to do it all over again, I will do it differently." End of quote. I'll certainly not go into all the details of what he said on these issues, otherwise there'll be no point. You're buying the book. I urge you to read the book and then make up your own mind whether you agree or disagree. I'm glad that he has laid several years of controversy to rest by speaking his own truth. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying that by any standards, Babangida's Journey of Service is an extraordinary book. It's a collection of stories from a life deeply intertwined with Nigeria's contemporary history.